What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHogs42 on the internet, and today we are going to be looking at the Leylines for this edition of the Overthinking MTG podcast, with a focus on Leyline of Anticipation. This is going to be one of those episodes where we look at a number of different cards, but I kind of have one helming the discussion. And this was actually a request submitted by Flying Sea Monkey. So Flying Sea Monkey, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And if you, dear viewer, have a request, feel free to send them in the Discord, on our Discord server. There is actually a channel specifically for overthinking requests. So, Leyline of Anticipation. What makes this card interesting? Well, all the Leylines have this text where if they start in your opening hand, you may begin the game with them on the battlefield. So they basically are totally free permanents that just exist if they're in your starting 7. So you can mulligan aggressively to them if that makes sense. And they all provide some kind of effect that is very, very good, especially if free. Although if you don't have them in your opening hand, they cost 2 and then 2 of whatever color they're in. They're all monocolor, all the ones we have as of this recording. So Leyline of Anticipation for 2 blue says you may cast spells as though they had flash. So this is actually an incredibly powerful card because if you have it in your opening hand, you then get it for free, and now every single spell, so every card in your hand effectively, it can be cast at instant speed. So you operate on your opponent's end steps, and you can hold up as much interaction as you want, even what would otherwise be sorcery speed interaction. You know, if you have Leyline of Anticipation down, somebody could attack you for lethal, and you could respond with a Wrath of God. You know, even if you don't have the Settle the Wreckage in hand, you can hit them with just a classic board wipe at instant speed. That is fantastic. You can wipe the board at the end step going into your turn and then set up your stuff. Like, you can do all kinds of goofy things with this. Leyline of Anticipation allows for creativity in your play style that is just truly fantastic. And this is very similar to a card called Vidalcan Orrery, which is a 4-drop and colorless that gives you this ability. And that actually sees a ton of commander players worth quite a bit because of the flexibility that it offers you. It also helps that the folks from Game Nights have been really big fans of that card. So the signal and the popularity of it is understandable. It's been very well boosted. But I tell you what, if you're in blue, Leyline of Anticipation gives you the exact same effect and potentially for free. Now, in Commander, the idea of starting with a Leyline in your opening hand is really, really bad. So if you're in a format where you have a 99-card deck, and, you know, where you have a 99-card deck, and you're only allowed 1 copy of each thing, Leylines are generally pretty bad. You don't want them unless you'd be willing to spend 4 for them every single time, because the chances of it showing up in the opener is just super duper low. If you're in a 60-card format where you're allowed to have 3 or 4 of these in your deck, then all of a sudden it's much, much stronger and much more reliable. The challenging part with cards like this is if you have multiple Leylines of Anticipation in your deck and you have one on the field, great, you have this effect. But if you draw a second one, that second one is a dead card in your hand. And so you don't want to have 4 of these in your deck necessarily. However, if you don't have 4 of them, the chances of them being in your opener are reduced dramatically. So it becomes this weird balancing act of how many do I run in order to make my deck do the thing and get value off of this. And also, if you're tapping, I mean, if you have to pay 4 mana for this, it feels really, really bad, honestly. The reason that other 4 mana setup pieces can happen in control decks in formats like Standard or Explorer, Pioneer, etc., is because they're cards like Mind Splice Apparatus or the Wandering Emperor who have flash. So you can keep your removal and keep your counters, keep your interaction up, and then cast them out on your opponent's end step. And so Leyline gives you that for all your cards, but it itself does not have it natively. So if it's in your opening hand, you're basically gonna have to tap out on 4 if you want this effect. And in most decks where you would want this effect, tapping out on 4 could be backbreaking. So it's this weird double-edged sword where if it's in your opening hand, it's fantastic, but if it's not in your opening hand, it really sucks that you have it in your deck. So it's a weird, I don't know, I like the card, I like it so much, but at the same time, when I'm optimizing my decks for Explorer or Historic, I almost never have Leyline of Anticipation in it, which is really a shame because I think the upside in this card is fantastic. So, okay, that's Leyline of Anticipation. But what about the others? So you'll notice in Arena, there's a whole sequence of Leylines that were printed in M20 or reprinted in many cases in M20. And they're all pretty cool in their own right, some of which are a bit more powerful than others. Now, these aren't the only Leylines that are out there. The Leylines were originally printed in Guild Pact. There was a whole set of them that came out. Some of them were excellent, and some of them were really awful. And over the years, they modified them. So M11 as well, so the core set 2011 had a number of Leylines as well. And it had its own sequence, which had its own... which I believe was when Leyline of Anticipation was introduced, but I could be wrong. But I don't know. It had their own benefits, their own drawbacks, their own challenges. And the M20 ones were kind of the most recent set. So I'm going to talk about all the M20 ones today for this video. And I'm going to call out a couple others that I think are noteworthy from the previous versions that we saw. So the next one that I want to talk about is Leyline of Abundance. This card is a house and a half. It is nothing short of absolutely savage, to the point where it has actually been banned in Pioneer and Explorer. And when I read it, I think you'll understand why. If Leyline of Abundance is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield, per Leyline rules. Whenever you tap a creature for mana, add an additional green. Or you could pay 6 green, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Why this thing has this activated ability tacked onto it, I have no idea. Like, none of the other Leylines do that. It's just for this one. But the static, the passive on it is far and away worth the price of admission. Whenever you tap a creature for mana, you add an additional green. So if you're telling me I start turn 1 with Leyline of Abundance in play, Forest, tap, Llanowar Elves, I untap on turn 2, hit my land, I now have access to 4 mana? Like, that is nuts! Like, so all of a sudden in my green devotion decks, I could be casting Karn Great Creator out on 2? What? Like, that's not a thing you're supposed to be able to do, for many obvious reasons. And then actually with Kiora and whatnot, that deck could go all kinds of crazy ways with this. So, as you can imagine, the upside of this is truly insane, and there are other cards that allow you to increase the power of mana dorks, such as Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, who we're probably going to touch on in a future video, because that card is a house and a half as well, but it doubles the effectiveness of your mana dorks effectively. You know, you add additional mana whenever you tap your dorks. I don't know why we call them dorks, by the way, but I'm going to keep doing it because we all know what we're talking about, right? But anyway, that all of a sudden just supercharges decks that care about mana creatures. It just does. And to the point where you're going to be casting 6 drops on turn 3, like, easily, like, without even trying, if not, you know, yeah, it's insane. So, Leyline of Abundance, this card has been banned in Pioneer and Explorer because it's just ridiculous. Oh, and on top of that, another thing I didn't think about, but the Green Devotion deck brings it to mind. These Leylines all carry 2 Devotion with them. So if they start on the battlefield for free, your Nykthos gets a bump just by this existing. So in the situation where, you know, we play turn 1 Llanowar Elves in the Green Devotion list with Leyline of Abundance on the battlefield, turn 2, you can play out Nykthos. And then you could tap your Forest, play out another Llanowar Elves, tap your Llanowar Elves for 2, you now have 4 Devotion on your Nykthos. So, yeah. Again, the sheer amount of ramp that this can generate is insane, which is why it ate the ban in those formats, where it would be relevant. So, yeah, pretty good stuff. Next up, I want to talk about Leyline of Combustion. This one is actually really cool. Now, the red Leylines, there have been a number of them throughout the years, and they do various things. Like, some of them are really excellent, and some of them totally suck eggs. But in the case of Leyline of Combustion, I think they hit the nail on the head. This one feels really good. So, it enters, if it's in your opening hand, you get it for free. Whenever you and/or at least one permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, Leyline of Combustion deals 2 damage to that player. I have seen Leyline of Combustion in Explorer being used in sideboards against the Rakdos Sacrifice lists. And the reason that I think that is especially cool is it takes what that deck is trying to do and it flips it, like what the Raksack deck is trying to do, and it just... I mean, it judo flips it back at them, because what that deck wants to do is ultimately loop sacrifice effects and ping you to death, oftentimes with Mayhem Devil. And so if they target you with a Mayhem Devil ping, that Mayhem Devil ping is going to deal 1 damage to you, but it also triggers Leyline of Combustion for every single ping, and that deals 2 damage back to their face. And so, yeah, you can try to pin me down with Mayhem Devils, but I have twice as much pain and damage going back at you. in some cases that's still worth it, but the ability to hate your opponent for targeting your face, I love that. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And as fun sideboard tech, this is excellent. And that right there is actually kind of the perfect Leyline effect in my opinion, because it's the kind of effect where the impact is meaningful. It does impact a game if certain conditions are met, but if this is for free on the battlefield at the beginning of the game, you're not automatically about to lose. You know, it has some effect without being overbearing and being the reason, you know, the deciding factor in most games. So honestly, I think that's great. I love this Leyline, to be honest. It's just really cool. And speaking of cards that are really good in sideboards and kind of meet these criteria as well, the next one that I want to talk about is the Leyline of Sanctity. This is the white version from M20. 2 white. If it's in your opening hand, get it for free. You have hexproof. That's it, period. That's all it does. So in many games, there are a ton of situations in which your opponent will not target you with anything. That happens. There are plenty of decks that don't do that. Like a lot of traditional aggro decks are like, I put a creature down and I attack you. Well, attacking isn't targeting, so I can swing at you all day, you know, and I can keep punching your face. But if I have, you know, if I'm playing a burn deck and I want to line up a bunch of grape shots at your face or hit you with a lightning strike, Leyline of Sanctity says, no, you can't do that. It just takes that option off the table. So this card is, and that effect, honestly, giving a player hexproof, there are a shocking number of things that this impacts. You know, if your opponent kept a great hand because they have a turn 1 Thoughtseize, but then you turn 0, drop Leyline of Sanctity onto the battlefield, well, guess what? That Thoughtseize, they can target themselves with it, but I don't know why you'd want to do that unless you're playing Greasefang and you need to get, you know, something in, you know, a part healing in your graveyard, which that is a fun interaction, by the way. You can totally do that, and it absolutely works, but 90% of the time, you want to hit your opponent with that effect. You can't if Leyline of Sanctity's down. So giving a player hexproof, it is incredibly powerful and something that you often don't consider because so many spells and effects just incidentally target the player. You know, there are so many situations where, like, even something as simple as Mind Rot, it says target player discards 2 cards. Well, you still have to target the player. You know, there are plenty of other effects that say each opponent does X, and in those cases, this is irrelevant. But if it says target, this shuts it down. I love it. I think Leyline of Sanctity is an awesome card. And again, I've seen sideboard decks or sideboards leverage this, or in formats where like direct targeted hate is common, then all of a sudden these is like a 2 of in the main deck is possible, which is, I don't know, kind of wild and all in all pretty cool. I like it. Next up, I want to talk about one of the classics, one of the best. You either love it or you hate it. As a graveyard player, I often hate it. And that is Leyline of the Void. This is a black card that, from what if I'm not mistaken, I know it used to, I'm sure it still does, see play in Modern as one of the go-to graveyard hosers, because honestly, it doesn't get better than this. 2 black, enchantment. If Leyline of the Void is in your opening hand, you may begin it with it on the battlefield. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. You'll notice it says from anywhere. That means if a creature dies, nope, goes to exile. So death triggers are just off the table. If your opponent tries to discard a card to try to reanimate it later, tough luck. That's going into exile. So Leyline of the Void really hoses on a lot of strategies. So that's fantastic, especially if you can start the game with it. If you can start the game with it, your opponents just don't get graveyards. And notably, it only hoses the opponent. It doesn't hose you at all. The other thing, though, to keep in mind with Leyline of the Void, unlike Rest in Peace, which is a very similar enchantment in white, Rest in Peace exiles graveyards when it enters the battlefield. Leyline of the Void does not. And actually, Rest in Peace is symmetrical as well. So if you get to turn 4 and you cast out Leyline of the Void from your hand, then your opponent's graveyard, whatever they have in there right now, is safe. It's gonna stay there. Nothing changes. But if they try to load it with anything else, that's where Leyline of the Void comes in. So the effect is incredibly powerful if your opponents are leveraging their graveyards. It just is. There's no way around it. It's one of the best ways to shut down graveyard strategies. As I understand it, when Dredge was super popular, this was like the go-to way, to the point where there were plenty of decks. And the other thing that's cool is you don't need to be running a black deck to run Leyline of the Void. Especially if your deck has like discard outlets, like any way to just churn it away if it's not useful. Because if it's in your opening hand, you just get it for free. There's no check that makes sure your deck is capable of producing black mana. You just get it. And that's true of all these Leylines, by the way. So any one of these Leylines can slot into your sideboard. Like Leyline of the Void in Historic and Explorer is really powerful and something that you could have a 3 of in your sideboard of any deck. And just pull those in if your opponent is using the graveyard. And then there's a chance you'll get it in your opening hand, and their whole strategy is just shut down, and they have to move on to plan B, whatever that might look like. Or destroy the Leyline first before they progress with their game plan. And that's really powerful. So Leyline of the Void is a massive hoser, and super powerful. I don't know, bottom line, it just is. And this is one of those that they reprint regularly because it's fantastic. It just does a lot of stuff, and a lot of decks need it. So, that said, if your opponent doesn't care about their graveyard, this is bubkiss. It does absolutely nothing. So be aware of what meta you're in. If people around you are using their graveyards frequently, this is probably worth considering. If not, just pass on it. All right, so those were the 5 Leylines that saw the reprint treatment in M20. So thank you for bearing with me as we go through those. I wanted to call out 2 other Leylines that really caught my eye when I was doing like a little bit of research for this. I was looking through some of the older Leylines. One of them I think is actually pretty cool, and the other not so much. So I want to talk about Leyline of Punishment. This one was printed in M11. And honestly, I want to call it out because I think there are a lot of like commander players that aren't using this right now who probably want it. Because honestly, in any mono red commander deck, I would probably want this in the list, especially if I'm trying to like burn my opponents out. So Leyline of Punishment, 2 red, starts on the field if it's in your opener. Players can't gain life and damage can't be prevented. Do you have any idea how much this hoses? A lot. The ability to completely negate life gain or damage prevention is nothing short of massive. There are tons of lockout combos that prevent your opponents from, or that prevent damage, and therefore you can't win. Well, Leyline of Punishment breaks that. Unfortunately, Leyline of Punishment is not on Arena as of this recording, which is such a bummer because I want this so badly to combat those 9 lives decks, because this would completely shut that down. It just, that whole combo just ceases to exist. And a lot of like Enchantress prison decks that are all about like preventing you from dealing damage, Leyline of Punishment just shuts that down completely, and that's a beautiful thing. So honestly, red players out there, keep like take a look at this. It's only legal Modern Legacy Vintage Commander, so it's only in Eternal formats, but still, holy cow, this card is excellent, and I want it in more places. Anyway, that's all I'm saying. I just want it in more places. Because could you imagine rocking mono red against life gain, dropping this on turn 0? Oh, feels good. Feels good. Anyway, the last one I want to talk about is a Leyline that is near and dear to my heart because it was one of those first cards that I read back when I was getting into I was into the game for almost a year by the time this came out. I thought it was funny, I thought it was humorous, and I couldn't believe they actually printed this on a card. It is Leyline of Singularity. I'm pretty sure I own a copy of this. It's just silly. This thing is weird. So 2 blue starts on the battlefield if it's in your opener. All non-land permanents are legendary. All of them. Every last non-land permanent. This card, it is so bad, yet so beautiful. Because you'll notice it doesn't say non-token. And so if your opponent is running, say, a treasure deck, well, guess what? Treasure is now legendary. So you're only allowed to have 1 permanent on the battlefield. You're only allowed 1 legendary permanent with the name treasure on your battlefield. So if you have a deck that's trying to make 1,000,000 treasures, tough luck, you get 1. And the legend rule sacrifices them before you can activate them for mana. You as a state-based action, you have to sacrifice all of them except 1. You don't get to use them before you lose them. They're just gone. Poof. So honestly, like, Leyline of Singularity as a hoser for things like Dockside Extortionist, I'm realizing are kind of awesome. Then you also add into effect like your Avenger of Zendikars, your Rampaging Baloths, all the token generators that people love to do to just go over the top. Scoot Swarm all of a sudden is no longer a thing. Like, this card is kind of amazing until somebody plays out a Mirror Box, and then you're just super sad. But honestly, and now that I think about it too, the Lord of the Rings set had a whole bunch of Legendary Matters cards in it. So that could be pretty fun. So it's one of those things where you don't want to have a lot of cards with the same name, a lot of the permanents with same names in your deck for this, but as a hoser to beat up on certain strategies, especially in Commander, all of a sudden I'm selling myself on this one pretty hard. That is a fun idea. So Leyline of Singularity, honestly, it's just goofy. Because there are also plenty of games where this does nothing. Like, straight up nothing. If you each have only one of any given permanent, so who cares if they're legendary? Yeah, it does straight up nothing. I think it's hilarious. Although, if somebody tried to resolve an Urza's Ruinous Blast with this on the field, I'd have to chuckle, because that's just fantastic. Anyway, although, now that I'm thinking about it, you could also run a lot of legendary instants and sorceries with Leyline of Singularity, because if you have any creatures, they're just good to go. So that could be fun. Anyway, the card's fun. It's definitely janky, because in many situations, like I said, it doesn't do much, but in the right situation, it can really hose a scenario. And this would present a weird situation for a commander pod to have to work around. So I like that. I like that a lot. Anyway, thank you so much for checking out this edition of the Overthinking MTG podcast. Flying Sea Monkey, again, thank you so much for your patience, as it took me a minute to get to this request, but I do appreciate it. And if you, dear listener, dear viewer, wants to submit a request as well, you can do that on our Discord server. There is a Linktree link in the description. You can go ahead and hit that, jump into the Discord. It is free to join, and we do have an Overthinking requests channel. Feel free to throw anything in there, and I will do my best to get to it. It may take me some time. Thank you for your patience. I do appreciate it. In the meantime, stay good to each other, and I'll catch you on the next one.